Next up, we have Bill Johnson, and he's got a video here that they recorded looking at herbicide burn down treatment. So let me get that up for you guys.
Well, good afternoon. It's June 17th, 2020, and in light of some of the COVID-19 restrictions that are being placed on universities with regard to field days, many of us across the Midwest and the Mid-South area are doing these video recordings to try to get some of our information out to the end users. And so today what we're going to do is we're going to walk down through some plots that we've sprayed some burn down treatments on about 12 days ago. And basically what I want to do is kind of walk you through some of the things that we're seeing. And this would be kind of a central or west central Indiana type of environment that we've had this spring. And we want to talk about some of the efficacy that we're seeing on mare's tail on one side and giant ragweed on the other side. And then we'll give you some conclusions to what we're seeing here at the end. The first thing we'll do here is we'll set up our plot layout and application parameters. So the first series of treatments we're going to discuss were applied on June 5th. Our weather conditions were mid-80s as far as temperature, and we were coming off a little bit of a wet spell. And so our plants were well hydrated, so we hadn't experienced any drought stress yet. And our horseweed was anywhere from 4 to 12 inches in height. Sprayer was set up with 15 gallon per acre of carrier volume, and these were walked on with a backpack sprayer. So the way the plots are laid out, the sign is in the middle of the plot, and we have untreated running checks, which I'll point out as we move further down the line here to kind of show you what the weeds would look like in these running checks, and this would be an unsprayed area. Okay, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to walk you through 4 different treatments. So we've got an untreated check here. We've got a glyphosate product in the next one, and then a glyphosate plus 2,4-D and a glyphosate plus dicamba. So I'm standing now in the untreated plot. We are 12 days after the application of the treatments in the other plot. The horseweed ranged from 4 to 12 inches in height when it was sprayed. And now we have horseweed ranging anywhere from about 8 to probably 24 inches tall or so. So this is what an untreated check looks like. As I move in this direction here, I'm moving into the plot that was treated only with glyphosate. So obviously this is a glyphosate resistant population of horseweed. You can see a few dead plants in here, but for the most part, what you see are plants that were initially injured by glyphosate. They would show some yellowing in the tops, and then they started to regrow. So we have thinned the population a little bit, but I would say well over 90% of this population is glyphosate resistant. So this was a very common site in the state of Indiana dating back to 2001, 2002, 2003. And so most of the state then at that point made some pretty quick transitions to doing different things, whether that was adding post-emergence chlorimuron or chloranthalam to their glyphosate program, getting some 2,4-D in the burn down to try to get this mare's tail population to behave more like we want it to behave. So one of the most common things that was done back in that era, and one of the cheaper things, or probably the cheapest thing, was simply to get some 2,4-D in the burn down treatment. So again, we're 12 days out here, and when we compare the control with glyphosate alone versus glyphosate plus 2,4-D, it's definitely better. But what you can see here is even with adding an auxin herbicide, whether it's 2,4-D or whether it's dicamba, we are not getting very rapid control of these plants. So we've beat them up pretty effectively. You know, I think we've largely protected soybean yield if we can come back in here and finish these off with 2,4-D, dicamba, or Liberty. But to get an effective burn down, even when we have hot, sunny weather, throughout most of the state of Indiana now, we need to do something more than just adding 2,4-D or dicamba to our burn down treatment. And that's why we talk an awful lot during our summer meetings about doing fall applied herbicides to get those mare's tail controlled that emerged in the fall of the year. So that way we don't have a population like this that we have to deal with in the spring. So as I move over to this plot that had Roundup plus dicamba, again, we see a very similar scenario here with Roundup dicamba versus Roundup 2,4-D. We're 12 days out. The plants aren't dead. They probably haven't grown all that much, but anytime I still see green on a plant 12 to 14 days out, I'm concerned that I'm going to have to come back in here and retreat. Okay, we're moving down the line here into some of our other treatments, and I'm standing in the running check or an unsprayed area. And we've got two different treatments that we're going to discuss here. So the treatment on my left would be Roundup plus Sharpen. The treatment on my right would be Roundup plus Sharpen plus 2,4-D, right? Yeah. Okay. So one of the things that became really obvious as we pointed out in the discussion of the previous plots was that adding 2,4-D or dicamba to glyphosate is better than glyphosate alone, but probably not getting us completely to where we want to be, where we want weeds that are for the most part dead at 12 to 14 days after treatment. So BASF developed the safe flufinicil product. I was part of that testing process around 15 years ago, and about 10 years or so ago that product came onto the market, and it really helped out in terms of being able to control mare's tail, giant ragweed, and some of the other weeds that are typically present early in the growing season. So what you can see here with this Roundup Sharpen treatment is we definitely have very good efficacy on the horseweed. We still have a few plants that have some green tops in them, and those plants will survive. They will go on and complete their life cycle if they're not treated again. But we've done a pretty good job of getting these things beat back and giving our post-emerge herbicide a better chance of working on a weed that's showing a little bit more injury symptoms. When we have the 2,4-D in with the Sharpen, what you can see here is better control. We still have some plants that have some green stems on them. We have a few regrowing in the front of the plot, which that could be a matter of getting the boom charged. But what you see as you scan the entire plot is you just don't see the plants that have the green tops in them. So having both the Sharpen and the 2,4-D with the glyphosate has been the best treatment that we've looked at so far today. All right, now I'm standing in between our two gramoxone-based treatments. So we have gramoxone and a metribuzin-based product on my left. We have gramoxone, metribuzin, and 2,4-D on my right. And what you see here is, again, a very quick efficacy with these gramoxone-based treatments. With the gramoxone Syncor that doesn't have the 2,4-D in it, much like we saw with the Sharpen treatment that didn't have 2,4-D in it, you do see a lot more plants that are green in the top and that will go on and complete their life cycle. They're set back quite a bit. They can be finished off with a post-emerge treatment of the right mode of action. But if we simply add 2,4-D into our gramoxone-based treatments, the efficacy is a little bit higher here. Not quite as good as what we're looking at with the glyphosate, safe flufinicil, and 2,4-D, but nonetheless, we did get a better kill where we had two alternative modes of action in this mixture as compared to the one alternative mode of action. Okay, and the last thing I want to talk about here with our mare's tail plots are these Liberty-based treatments. Now, typically we don't think of Liberty as a good burn down herbicide because Liberty as a herbicide works much better under sunny, hot conditions with high humidity. So typically if we're doing burn down treatments in April, we don't have that kind of weather in the eastern corn belt. Now, given the fact that we did these burn down treatments in early June, we had 80 degree and sunny weather, and we also had some well-watered plants. Liberty was really active, and that's kind of an optimal situation to use Liberty. So on the left here, we have Liberty Plus On the left here, we have Liberty by itself. On the right here, we have Liberty with 2,4-D, okay? So again, as you look across these plots, the efficacy was very fast. It's been fairly complete with both Liberty and the Liberty 2,4-D. And so for those of us that didn't get our beans planted in early May, if we're into this June planting time frame because of wet weather, or perhaps we're double cropping, this would be a good situation here to use a Liberty-based herbicide for a burn down program. So to wrap up our discussion of mare's tail burn downs with early June applied burn down treatments, obviously it's a glyphosate resistant population. Adding 2,4-D and dicamba to glyphosate was definitely better than glyphosate alone, but we really needed two or more active modes of action in that mixture to get effective burn down control. So treatments that had glyphosate plus sharpen plus 2,4-D, Gramoxone Sencor plus 2,4-D, or the Liberty-based programs were the programs that gave us the most thorough control of mare's tail. And again, what we're really trying to do is we're trying to get 98 to 99% control. We want to stunt these plants as much as possible, and we want to be able to have our give our post-emerge herbicide an opportunity to work. So that's kind of the summary of mare's tail burn down, and we'll go on and talk about giant ragweed next. One of the things that we frequently encounter in our no-till systems in the state of Indiana is not only do we have things like mare's tail, chickweed, henbit, purple dead nettle, crestleaf groundsel, and some of the winter annual grasses to deal with, but it's not uncommon to have some of our early emerging summer annual weeds like giant ragweed, lamb's quarter, and foxtail to be emerged at the time that we're doing these burn down treatments. And so one of the things I think particularly that's become more important is the ability of this burn down herbicide to work on these early emerging summer annual weeds. So typically with grasses like foxtail or even fall panicum that might come up early, glyphosate works really well on those grasses. We haven't had any issues. Where we've run into challenges is getting good activity on lamb's quarter and giant ragweed in the spring under some cool, cloudy weather conditions. Now, the good news is that with the herbicides that we use in a burn down scenario, both lamb's quarter and giant ragweed are fairly easy to control. So efficacy is almost always fairly complete and fairly high when we have things like 2,4-D, dicamba, or saflufenicil, the sharpened product, in the tank. So we didn't see quite the treatment separation out here with those particular herbicides, but the key thing to keep in mind is whenever we have cool, cloudy weather, we just need to be careful with lamb's quarter, because lamb's quarter becomes really tolerant to glyphosate treatments when we have cool, cloudy weather. Giant ragweed, on the other hand, giant ragweed is so sensitive to dicamba and 2,4-D that we really can have effective control of those weeds just by having at least 8 ounces. We'd like to see 16 or more, but at least 8 ounces of one of those products in the tank for a burn down situation. So we're not going to walk you through all these giant ragweed plots. We just basically wanted to give you a summary there that, again, for those weeds, dicamba or 2,4-D or sharpen is going to be a very effective program. But if you have mare's tail, you need to make sure you have at least 2 active sites of action in there to pick up the mare's tail. Because it's probably not likely that you have many no-till fields that have giant ragweed and that don't have mare's tail, because mare's tail has become so prevalent over the last 15 to 20 years.
Hello, my name is Jesse Harmon. I'm a second-year PhD student with Bill Johnson in the Weed Science Group at Purdue. We're standing here at Davis Purdue Ag Center, where I'm overseeing 13 company field trials. These trials were planted in late May and received a half inch of rain immediately after pre-emergence herbicide application. Throughout the month of June, though, we received relatively little rain, which slightly stressed the crops, but also led to exceptionally high pre-emergence herbicide efficacy.
Good morning. I'm Bill Johnson, Extension Weed Scientist at Purdue University. It's July 1st, 2020, and this morning we're here at the Davis-Purdue Agricultural Center in Eastern Indiana, and we're shooting some videos of our weed control plots. So in this particular trial right here, we're looking at a lot of the commercially available atrazine premixes as a pre-emerge treatment alone and as a split treatment where we put on a portion of it pre-emerge and a portion of it post-emerge. So on my right-hand side, we have Residual, full labeled rate of Residual, and on the left-hand side, we have Harness Max, okay? So these trials were initiated in late May, around May 26th. The pre-emerge treatments were put on May 26th, so it's July 1st, or about 5 weeks after the application date. Our weather conditions were, we had a ½ inch of rain almost immediately on these pre-emerge treatments. Then it was dry, very dry for about 3 weeks, and then more recently we've had some rainfall events. So what we have in the front on each side of me is a full labeled rate of Residual and Harness Max. And in the plots directly behind me, these plots are 30 feet long, in the plots directly behind me, we have treatments of the same herbicides where some of it was put on pre-emerge and then a post-emerge treatment of the same herbicide was put on around June 20th. And we're about 10 days or so after that post-emerge treatment. So what this very clearly shows is that pre-emerge herbicides are very valuable to use at planting. And what we see here, where we have the full labeled rate pre-emerge, is we have held the weeds back easily for 5 weeks, but we're starting to have some breaks now, okay? So this particular corn is at the V7 stage. It's about knee high on me. So we're kind of getting into a situation where we have limited things that we can do from a post-emerge standpoint because the corn is at an advanced growth stage. It's beyond the V6, which really starts to limit what we can do. Now, if we take a look at the plots directly behind these, where we had some of the pre-emerge herbicide put on at planting and then some of it about 10 days or so ago, those plots are completely weed-free at this stage. And so it does show the advantage of breaking up that residual, putting some of it on pre-emerge, some of it on post-emerge, and that helps to buy you a little bit of insurance against situations where we run into dry spells or extremely wet spells and our pre-emerge herbicides start to break early. Okay,
Right.
Phil, do I have control here?
Yep. If you want to share your screen or whatever, yeah. So any questions for Bill, you can enter them in the chat. It doesn't have to be about Burndown, but any weed questions whatsoever.
Yep. Yeah, go ahead and fire them. Phil, do you have any in your that have been emailed to you directly?
I've got a couple questions here. So I know that this spring we had that court case talking about dicamba. So is the future of dicamba in soybeans, at least, is that done with? Because I know 3 of the 4 products for labeled for soybeans were taken off the market then. So
Right. Yeah. No, my read on it is right now there's a heck of a seed supply that's going to be available, and I know the companies have submitted registration packages for new formulations to EPA to be considered. So my read on the whole situation is that EPA is very likely to approve some formulations of dicamba for use in soybeans for next year. And I know that's what the companies that carry the seed and the product are relaying to growers as well. So as of right now, I would plan on the ability to use a dicamba-based soybean system next year. All right. Any other questions? I'll check the chat box here.
All right, so here's one. Are there any control options for tall mare's tail in soybeans now? I'm guessing right now mare's tail are poking above the soybean canopy. Or other late season option for other weeds and grasses. I guess.
Yeah, you bet. If the kids aren't back in school yet, send them out there with a hoe. That's really the only. So if you think about what we have labeled for use herbicide wise in soybeans right now, there's nothing labeled for use in soybeans that have more than 30% grain moisture and we're past the flower stage. So the only thing that you could use legally would be something in a rope wick type of applicator, and then you have to weigh the benefit or the detriment of driving over a lot of soybeans as far as the weed control benefit. So the non-smart aleck answer to the question is that there isn't anything that's labeled other than something you would put on with a rope wick applicator. And in order to make a rope wick applicator work on something like that doesn't have a lot of leaf area, you need to hit it from two directions, and so you're going to be running over the beans twice with whatever you're using through that rope wick applicator. But another common question I'm getting along that same lines is, what can I do to water hemp to reduce seed production? And again, if most of the water hemp is glyphosate, ALS, and PPO resistant, then you don't have labeled options really that can be used other than dicamba and 2,4-D. And again, we've got the cutoff to deal with of June 20th with dicamba. With 2,4-D, we're well past the R2 growth stage for its cutoff, and so there's nothing legally that can be done. Now, as we get later in the growing season, there are some harvest aid treatments that can be used in soybeans, but usually those are done after the beans drop the leaves, and then again after your grain moisture is 30% or less.
So we have another question. I think is there an issue with the early cutoff date with soybeans with dicamba products? And I guess now they have to spray that early, and now they're having palmer going to seed. So any solutions with that?
Well, for this year, no. I mean, and again, about all you can do to prevent seed production at this time of the year is either hand weeding or some kind of a rope wick. Now, I would not put dicamba or 2,4-D in a rope wick and drive that unit across a soybean field that doesn't have that trait. The dicamba would be illegal anyway. If you put 2,4-D in a rope wick, I would not drive that across the field that doesn't have the 2,4-D resistant trait in it for fear of damaging the beans, for getting exposure to the beans, number one. And number two, the legality of it is just not there as well. So there's nothing legally they can do. As we get into this pre-harvest type of a treatment, then you have to ask yourself, okay, is the money that I'm going to spend on the pre-harvest treatment worth the benefit that I'm going to get from minimizing seed production? So you would want to go out into the field, see if those Palmer amaranth plants have already produced seed, and by that time many of them will have black or brown seeds on them. If they have black or brown seeds on them, then the seed is mature, and you're really not doing yourself a lot of good from that standpoint.
So then,
go ahead. I don't know if
I think. Well, what about for next year? So assuming you can use the dicamba product again. And another question is related to that. So next year, you said you'd have dicamba that you foresee it's going to be on the market, a different formulation. In Indiana, are we still looking at that same June 20th cutoff date?
Yeah, so again, the state chemist makes that decision, but my read is that they are they're fairly pleased with the purpose of the cutoff date and the result that it's had. So the purpose of the cutoff date is to reduce the number of off-site incident reports and reduce the number of of the complaints that they have to process, and it's had that effect. So I really don't see them making a dramatic change in that cutoff date, because it did have the desired effect at reducing the cases and the case load that they have to deal with as far as off-target movement. As far as how to plan a weed control program, one of the things that I've been really frustrated with over the last couple of years is we're going down the same pathway that we went with Roundup Ready 25 years ago, and that we're throwing the residual herbicides out the window, and we're putting so much reliance on that post-emerge herbicide to do all of our weed control. So, we've been through this, well, more than once. We went through it with ALS inhibitors in the late 80s and early 90s. We went through it again with the glyphosate-based program starting in the mid-1990s, where we become so reliant on the post-emerge herbicide that we spray it multiple times, and that just drives that resistance curve. And so the same thing is going to happen with dicamba and 2,4-D. I mean, we're already screening populations of water hemp for dicamba resistance. So it's only a matter of time until we have that first one that we label, and congratulations to the county that has it, and then from there it will develop in other counties as well. So what we really need to do is, again, get back to basics. The residual herbicides have always been and still are the backbone of our weed control programs in corn and beans. And unfortunately, we migrate, regardless of the technology, we want to migrate to this system where we become so reliant on the post-emerge herbicides. So for palmer and water hemp in particular, residual herbicides, full rates of residual herbicides, not the planned failure setup rates, but full rates of residual herbicides, and then timely post-emerge treatments. And that post-emerge treatment needs to have a group 15 with it as well to help suppress that late season emergence.
So is there any confirmed dicamba resistance in Indiana yet?
None that are confirmed, but we have some populations that it takes higher rates to kill in our greenhouse studies. And so we just need to, we'll do some more work with those. And it'll be like the early days of glyphosate resistant mare's tail. What'll happen is it'll take a herbicide rate that's right at the limit of the 1x rate, sprayed to a small plant, applied with your mouth held right in order to make it die. And so that's what'll happen first. We'll have these plants that show low level resistance. And then what happens over time as this resistance curve evolves is eventually you have small plants that you don't touch with a 1x rate, and those will be mixed in there with dead plants. And then eventually you'll be able to spray entire fields and kill very few plants. And then we'll react and say, man, we need to do something different. If I've kind of watched this resistance curve evolve a couple of times. So none that are confirmed yet, but some that are just a lot tougher to kill. And in a lot of cases, they're in situations where dicamba was used in corn for many years. And then in soybeans, we've gotten into this respray program. And so when the resprays don't kill it, that's when it kind of comes to our attention. And we've gone out and collected a few plant samples both last summer and this summer, and we're working on those in the greenhouse right now.
Okay, so here's a question. I want your thoughts on the Perpetuo herbicide by Valent. So
Yeah, I got to remember the active ingredients. It's a pre-mix of, I've got to look it up now. It's a Zidua. It's a pre-mix of active ingredients we already have. So our opinion is going to be whatever our opinions were of those active ingredients, which you can get out of the weed control guide. In the weed control guide, there are weed response tables in the front section of each crop, and we give you a relative efficacy number for both single products and the commonly used pre-mixed products. So, again, I'd have to remind myself on the ingredients there, but I think it's just a matter of going in there and looking up those active ingredients and figuring out what weeds they work well on and what weeds they need some help with. Okay.
So another comment saying if we have this dicamba cutoff date of June 20th, which likely happens, and then we've got our water hemp and palmer that keeps emerging even with in-crop residuals. Is this good technology for Indiana then in that situation?
Well, it's planted on 60% of the acres this year, so somebody likes it. So here again, here's where you start. You think through this whole process, and for those fields that require resprays, what was the entire weed control program for that respray? Was it a situation where clean tillage, beans were planted, and then you did all of your weed control with post-emerge treatments? And if you have to respray that situation in Indiana, I'm like, that happens every year, right? If we don't use a residual herbicide, well over 50% of our soybean acres are going to require to be sprayed post-emergence twice, because we have an environment with plenty of rainfall, and we have weeds like water hemp, giant ragweed, crabgrass, and stuff like that, morning glories, that have relatively long emergence patterns. And so it's very unlikely that a single trip over the field is going to provide complete weed control. So that's where I would come back to that is, I'm going to answer the question. The technology is fine. It's how the technology is used that kind of determines its value. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that we do have the ability in the E3 beans, and next year, if Bayer gets the approvals for XtendFlex, in both the XtendFlex and the E3 technologies, will have the ability to spray Liberty. Liberty does not have a calendar cutoff date. It has a calendar cutoff soybean growth stage. And so if a person is bound and determined to focus just on post-emerge weed control, then you're going to be in a situation where you spray your dicamba early because you have a cutoff date, and you have the ability to use Liberty late. You have the ability to use Roundup both early and late. And so if you have a situation where you have some glyphosate resistant weeds, and then your Roundup kind of becomes your primary grass herbicide. But again, it's all about how the technology is used. It doesn't mean that it's bad technology. It just means that the use pattern it needs some tweaking. Okay. Any other question?
Well, I guess so. They're saying they're seeing lots, even with the residuals, they're seeing lots of water hemp out there in their area.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you're on a muck soil, that makes sense. It's hard to make residual herbicides work as well on muck soils as they do on mineral soils. I'd ask the question, what rates did you use? What were the active ingredients, and what were your rainfall patterns like? I think if in Indiana this year, if you're in an area that has drought-prone soils, and you think about that dry spell that we had in June, we had a dry spell in June that was, borderline drought, and your soybeans are short and they didn't canopy. Those were environments there where it's not uncommon to see water hemp leaking through there. Throughout a lot of the state, it's not uncommon to see water hemp leaking through the crop canopy. And some of it driven by the fact that, we had a really dry June and we didn't get quick canopy development because the beans were water stressed. But I also know that residual herbicide use went way down this year, driven by a lot of different factors. Number one, the promise that dicamba was the next Roundup, and number two, low soybean commodity prices, and folks were looking to cut costs. So there's a lot of reasons for it. I mean, it doesn't really mean that the technology is bad, but in situations where the crop canopy is hugely important. Basically what we try to do with herbicides is we try to give that crop a 6-week head start. And then once we get canopy development, we're pretty reliant on that crop canopy to give us weed control throughout 2/3 of the growing season. So basically you're looking at the first third is herbicide based, and your last 2/3 are based on the crop canopy. And so, anything we can do to supplement our herbicides, whether it's using the right rate whether it's picking the right herbicide for the weed population or figuring out ways to incorporate non-chemical means. Whether that's a high biomass cover crop can be very beneficial in soybean on some weeds. We also know that people are now, getting back into wider rows and using some row cultivation as well. So, the thing to look at is, we no longer have a herbicide market like it was in the 80s and 90s, where the promise of a new active ingredient always kind of gave us some hope that we could continue down this path of chemical only weed control. There's no new active ingredients. There's no new sites of action that are coming to market anytime soon. There's some new active ingredients, but their sites of action we're already using. So there's a pretty good probability that, those things are going to have kind of a short life cycle. So we really need to think about, some of the old tried and true methods of weed control and how can we incorporate some of these non-chemical things with our herbicides to extend the life of our herbicides.
Guess one more thing along those lines, more of a long future thing. Recently, with all those glyphosate lawsuits and everything, what kind of future, you mentioned some of that, non-chemical options for weed control do you see coming down? Because, if our regulatory environment changes where we might be losing some of this technology, not just to resistance, but to regulatory things. So yeah. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, that kind of ties into my last statement there. I think the fact that we're in the middle part of the country, we're going to see things like, the dicamba cutoff dates, times, temperatures, whatever you want to call it. I don't think those things are going to go away. I don't have the vision, though, that we're going to be banning glyphosate or banning glufosinate or things like that. I don't see that happening anytime in the near future like you would if you were out on the West Coast, for example. But in terms of, what we can do from a non-chemical standpoint, for me right now, the low-hanging fruit is, tillage. Whether it's pre-plant tillage or row crop cultivation, that's low-hanging fruit. And again, we don't want to go back to tearing up soil if we don't have to, but there are some high residue cultivators. We bought one for our research program, but there are high residue cultivators that can be used in those systems. Number two, understanding how you can make a cover crop help you. So again, what we've learned with cover crops is that high biomass cover crops in soybeans can be pretty reliable on a couple of weeds. But it does require additional management. It's not a matter of throwing seed out there, planting beans, and then, hoping for the best. I mean, the cover crop has to be terminated at the right time. Your planting equipment has to work to get seed placement and seed emergence. So I see those two as things that there's a lot of people that can make cover crops and tillage work. Things like electrocution, I think that's interesting, but when you look at the timing of electrocution, and there's a lot of videos that have been posted recently on electrocution, the timing of electrocution right now is late in the year to prevent seed production. By that time, the competitive effect is already done. And then it's kind of like rope wicking. You're still driving a piece of equipment across cropland, and you're going to do some damage with that. I think if electrocution can be used earlier in the year, and someone can figure out a way to run the probes down in between the rows, so we can electrocute smaller weeds. I think that one is going to become more of an early season tactic that we can use. Right now, that is a late season. So early season tillage, whether it's pre-plant or row cultivation, and then figuring out how to make a cover crop work are probably the two things that we can do in the short term.
All right, thanks, Bill. And I guess if you have any other further questions, just reach out to Bill and he'll answer them for you. And that concludes our program for our Pinney Purdue Field Day